Jaya Raja Madhava Kunja Vihari
Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari
Jaya Gopi Jana Radha Girivaradari
Jaya Gopi Jana Girivaradari
Jaya Gopi Jana Radha Girivaradari
Gopi Jana Girivaradari
Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana
Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana
Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana
Yashodanandana Braja Jana Ranjana
Yamunatira Vanachari
Yamunatira Vanachari
Yamunatira Vanachari
Yamunatira Vanachari
Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Vihari
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 Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Rama Rama Rama
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare Rama Rama
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare
Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama
Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada
Jai Jai Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Prabhupada.
Nitai Gaura Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Nitai Gaura Hari Bol
Nitai Gaur Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol.
Srila Prabhupada ki
Jai.
Shri Kodana Nitai Mayapur Shashi ki
Jai.
Shri Tulsinath Maharaj ki Jai Shri Giridhar Lal ki Jai Shri Nrsimhadev Gaurana ki Jai
Jai.
Anantakoti Vaishnava Vrinda ki Jai
Jai.
Rantra Srimad Bhagavatam ki Jai Nitai Gaura Premanandi
Hari Bol.
Om Vishnu 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 Do I need the microphone, is it?
Sure.
That's okay.
I think
Are we broadcasting or not?
it's broadcasting, yeah.
I'll just have to speak loud. Reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, chant Hare Krishna and fight. In 1925, said Prabhupada, I went to the Mela. I remember I was touching the water and it was so pinching that it was cutting your body. But as soon as you actually get a dip, 1, 2, 3, then you immediately come out and it was all right. Prabhupada mentioned the 1928 Mela when he was carrying his young child. I was in the midst of the crowd, he recalled. It was so big that I was afraid that if there was any rush, this child may be finished. But by the grace of Krishna, nothing happened. What is the reason for the Mela? Asked Prabhupada's servant Hari Shori. Is it something about drops of nectar from the Mohini Murti? It is actually a religious conference, Prabhupada replied. All the different groups gather in that holy place and they propagate their philosophy there. India is a country of religion. They know spiritual life is more important than this material life. That is India. Now they are diverting their attention to the material. Otherwise, the whole of India is for spiritual life. Srila Prabhupada ki
Jai.
Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, Chapter 11, Text 16. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Vasudevaya.
Na Javat etan mana atma lingam na Javat etan mana atma lingam na Javat etan mana atma lingam samsara tapavapanam janasya samsara tapavapanam janasya
Samsara tapavapanam janasya.
samsara tapavapanam janasya
Samsara tapavapanam janasya.
yach
Yat
choka
choka
mahomaya
mohamaya
raga
raga
loba
loba
yach choka mohamaya raga loba
yaschoka mohamaya raga loba
yach choka mohamaya raga loba
yaschoka mohamaya raga loba
vairanubandam
Vairanubandam
mamatam vidate vairanubandam mamatam vidate
Viranubandam mamatam vidate
vairanubandam mamatam vidate
Vairanubandam mamatam vidate
Nayavadetan mana atmalingam
Nayavadetan mana atmalingam
Sansara tapavapanam janasya
Samsara tapavapanam janasya
Yachchoka mohamaya raga loba
Yaschoka mohamaya raga loba
Vairanubandam mamatam vidate
Vairanubandam mamatam vidate
Nayavadetan mana atmalingam
Mayavade Yavadetanmana Atmalingam
Samsara tapavapanam janasya
Samsara Tapa Papanam Janasya
Yachchoka moha maya raga loba
Yashoka Moha Maya Raga Loba
Vairana bandam mamatam vidate
Vairana Bandam Mamatam Vidate
Follow
Na Yavadetanmana Atmalingam
Nayavadetam mana atmalingam
Samsara Tapa Papanam Janasya
Samsara tapavapanam janasya
Yashoka Moha Maya Raga Loba
Yachchoka moha maya raga loba
Vairana Bandam Mamatam Vidate
Vairana bandam mamatam vidate No, not Javat, as long as etat, this mana, mind, atmalingam, existing as the false designation of the soul, samsara tapa, of the miseries of this material world, avapanam, the growing ground, janasya, of the living being, yat, which, shoka, of lamentation, moha, of illusion, amaya, of disease, raga, of attachment, lobha, of greed, vaira, of enmity, anubandham, the consequence, mamatam, the sense of ownership, vidate, gives. Translation: the soul's designation, the mind, is the cause of all tribulations in the material world. As long as this fact is unknown to the conditioned living entity, he has to accept the miserable condition of the material body and wander within this universe in different positions. Because the mind is affected by disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed and enmity, it creates bondage and a false sense of intimacy within this material world. Please repeat. The soul's designation, the mind, is the cause of all tribulations, in the material world. As long as this fact is unknown, to the conditioned living entity, he has to accept the miserable condition of the material body, and wander within this universe, in different positions. Because the mind is affected by disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed and enmity, it creates bondage, and a false sense of intimacy, within this material world. Purport by Srila Prabhupada Ki. The mind is the cause of both material bondage and liberation. The impure mind thinks, I am this body. The pure mind knows that he is not the material body. Therefore the mind is considered to be the root of all material designations. Until the living entity is aloof from the association and contaminations of this material world, the mind will be absorbed in such material things as birth, death, disease, illusion, attachment, greed and enmity. In this way the living entity is conditioned and he suffers material miseries. Om Jnanatimirandasya Gnanjana Shalakaya Chakshurumlitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. I was born in the darkest ignorance, but my spiritual master was forced to open my eyes. With the torchlight of knowledge I offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Shri Chaitanya Mano Vishtam Vishtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Dharmayam Dadati Swapadantikam. When will Srila Rupa Goswami was established within this world the mission for fulfilling the desire of Lord Chaitanya, give me shelter to his lotus feet. Anshkalpa Tarubhya Kripa Sindhavya Vichaparitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Let us offer our respectful obeisances unto all the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord, who can fulfill the desires of everyone like desire trees, and who are full of compassion for the fallen conditioned souls. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shiva Sari Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So this is a very important verse. I mean, it's it's very similar to the verses in Bhagavad Gita. For one who has controlled the mind is the best of friends. For one who has failed to do so, the mind remains the greatest enemy. And actually the word here, Vaira, is like enemy, just like in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says, it is lust only, O Arjuna, born of contact with the mode of passion, and later transformed into wrath, which is the all-devouring, sinful enemy of this world. So, yes, so by misidentification, then our spiritual life becomes devoured by the mind. And the whole purpose of the Vedic literature and the whole purpose of the instructions of our acharyas is to rescue the mind from this material entanglement. And it's interesting that this is actually Vyasadev's first realization after he goes into meditation, after Narada Muni appears to Vyasadeva and explains the cause of his despondency. Vyasadeva feels that he hasn't fulfilled his mission of presenting the Vedas in a way which is applicable to specifically to the people of Kali Yuga. So after Narada Muni appears to him and instructs him, then Srila Vyasadeva goes into meditation, and after coming out of that meditation, then he says, so it's Bhakti Yoga Nama. This is Canto 1, Chapter 7, Text 5. Bhakti Yoga Namanasi Samyak Praniyate Malaya Pasyat Purusham Punam Mayam Shatada Pashrayam. Srila Vyasadeva thus fixed his mind, perfectly engaging it by linking it in devotional service without any tinge of materialism. And thus he saw the absolute personality of Godhead along with his external energy, which was under full control. Yaya samoito jiva atmanam tri gunatmakam paropi manate natam tatgutam charipadyate. Due to this external energy, the living entity, although transcendental to the three modes of material nature, thinks of himself as a material product, and thus undergoes the reactions of material miseries. So this verse is describing that, today's verse. It's describing how the living entity, although he is pure spirit soul, and although the mind is actually constitutionally in the mode of goodness, and the mind is designed or created to allow the living entity to exist in pure consciousness, but nevertheless, due to the external energy, due to Maya, and due to the contact with Maya, then the living entity thinks of himself as a material product, and thus undergoes the reactions of material miseries. And today's verse indicates that in this condition the living entity has no choice. That although the mind gives the illusion of choice, the nature of the thinking process gives us an illusion that we have choice. But actually there's no real choice. The only choice is what we've been given the menu by Maya Devi, and the menu is different varieties of disease, lamentation, illusion, attachment, greed and enmity. So we can choose a different item on the menu at every moment we can choose, and this gives us the illusion that we're actually choosing. But it's just different degrees of illusion, and also by choosing one of those different degrees of illusion, then we get entangled in the reactions of putting energy into that illusion. So Srila Prabhupada says here in today's verse, until the living entity is aloof from the association and contaminations of this material world, the mind will be absorbed in material things. So it's, although it seems that we have independence and that we're making real choices, it's actually illusion. And it's interesting, someone's put a bookmark, I don't know whether someone quoted this verse yesterday, but in chapter 6 of the Bhagavad Gita, for him who has conquered the mind is the best of friends, but for one who has failed to do so, his mind will remain the greatest enemy. Then the next verse, for one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, each and cold, honour and dishonour are all the same. So in one sense, this is, living entity is described as the marginal energy, Tatashta Shakti, situated on, Tata means bank, literally means like the bank between the river and the ocean. Sometimes when a big river enters the ocean, it creates like a turbulence under the water, and it churns up the sand under the water, and that sand creates a sandbank, which is like delineates the junction between the ocean and the river. But it's very transitory, and at any moment it can be washed away again. It never becomes actually like an island. So the living entity is on that sandbank between the ocean, which can be compared to the Supreme Lord and to the ocean of devotional service, and the turbulent waters of the river. So and whichever way the living entity chooses to go, whether he chooses to go into the ocean, and the ocean here is, for one who has conquered the mind, the super soul is already reached, for he has attained tranquility. To such a man, happiness and distress, each and cold, honour and dishonour, all the same. So when we have this experience that perhaps when we're chanting our japa or engaging in some service that requires a lot of concentration, that if we're not giving full attention to our service, then we become we experience turbulence and dissatisfaction and uncertainty and fear. And because of our conditioning through many lifetimes, the natural tendency is to take shelter of the inferior energy. The natural tendency is to jump back into the river, which, although it's very turbulent and very and it's characterized by anger, greed, lust, illusion, but because it's something we feel comfortable with because we've been in that environment for such a long time. It feels more comfortable to be back in the river than it does on the sandbank. But by accepting the association of devotees who are fixed in devotional service, by accepting the instructions of the self-realized spiritual master who actually is fixed in devotional service, then we can enter into the ocean. And then when we do so, then the super soul is already reached, we've attained tranquility. And Srila Prabhupada says in this purport, when one's mind is fixed on the superior nature, he has no alternative but to follow the dictation of the Supreme. So this is our goal. This is actually Raganuga Bhakti, that the development of a strong attachment to the service of the Lord. So in the beginning, Vaidhi is necessary. It's necessary to follow the rules and regulations because the mind is so habituated to taking shelter in the inferior material energy that even when we're actually performing devotional service with our body, still the mind is still hankering after the comfort of the material energy. So it's so strong, it's such a strong illusion. Srila Prabhupada says, as long as one's mind remains an unconquered enemy, one has to serve the dictations of lust, hunger, avarice. But when the mind is conquered, one voluntarily agrees to abide by the dictation of the personality of Godhead. Real yoga practice entails meeting the Paramatma within the heart and then following his direction. So, it sounds so easy in theory, but it's so difficult in practice. And that difficulty is due to underestimating the power of the mind. And therefore it needs to be a very strong, regulated practice, daily practice. Because the mind is in the mode of goodness constitutionally, then it's designed to accept regularity and discipline. And it responds to that regularity and discipline in a progressive way. It doesn't respond to false enthusiasm in a progressive way. It doesn't respond to passionate over-endeavour in a progressive way. In fact, that kind of activity actually agitates the mind. So sometimes a feeling of excitement or elation or enthusiasm for a particular activity, it may seem to us that it's conducive to controlling the mind, but it's actually not. There's no There's no kind of shortcut to controlling the mind. It requires steady, regulated sadhana, and it requires guidance from those who really understand the nature of the task. And it requires regular reading of Shastra to understand this. Actually, these verses I was reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, describing Vyasadev's first realizations of the real nature of the process of Bhakti Yoga. Then I've studied these verses for many years. And one verse in particular, which is Canto 1, Chapter 7, Text 7. Yasyam vai shriyamananam Krishna Paramapurushe Bhakti Utpadyate Pumsa Shokamoha Bhayapaha. Simply by giving oral reception to this Vedic literature, the feeling for loving devotional service to Lord Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, sprouts up at once to extinguish the fire of lamentation, illusion, and fearfulness. So this is this is a very important verse, but it's very important to understand what sprouts up means. In today's verse, the word avapanam, the growing ground, is described. So one of the purposes of regulated devotional service, Vaidhi Bhakti, is to prepare the ground so that the seed of devotional service can sprout. So before the feeling for loving devotional service sprouts up, then there needs to be a fertile ground in which the seed can germinate. And even when a seed first sprouts, it can very easily be buried again by heavy rainfall, by being trampled on, by people walking across it, or by disease. So although the actual experience of bhakti sprouting up in the heart is a very powerful experience, we shouldn't misinterpret it as being the solution in itself. This misinterpretation is based on sense gratification. It's like, it feels good, it feels amazing, it feels like I've just had some amazing transformation, that enthusiasm for devotional service has sprouted up in my heart. Now, I must have actually cracked it. I must have actually overcome the material energy. No, it's not the case. It requires constant application and constant protection of that very, very vulnerable little sprout. So it's very nice that devotees, disciples of Srila Prabhupada are now writing books describing this process, and they're really stressing the importance of applying this understanding in a scientific way. One way that we can judge our where we are in devotional service is how many times during the day are we actually forgetting Krishna? how many times during the day are we forgetting the Shastra? Or you could take it in another way, how regularly are we remembering Krishna? How regularly are we actually remembering the deities, remembering our instructions that we may have absorbed to some degree from hearing Srimad Bhagavatam class? So it actually needs to become constant meditation, constant remembrance. So if it's a long way away from being constant, then we can understand that we're allowing that little sprout to become trampled upon, to become washed away. Okay, I'll stop there and ask for any comments or questions.
Javat manages to enthuse Maharaj Rahugana, doesn't he, to take up devotional service? I believe, is that right?
Yes.
So it must be a great art to be able to fill people with awareness of how difficult it is, and at the same time fill them with the conviction that they can do it. So does that vary according to each person? And Javat, as far as we know, Javat didn't say anything to his father along these lines. So was it because the king was so qualified and elevated that he could take it straight? He could take the direct assessment of
it would appear to be the case, because this is the first time that we know that Javat actually spoke in his entire life. Also because he's a king, and
nobody wants to tell the king.
He's a king, and he's obviously he's living in the time in which kings did have association with, if not certain persons, at least with Brahmins, and were familiar with the Vedic literature in terms of how to govern their kingdom. So Javat knew that Maharaj Rahugana at least had the intellectual capacity to be able to process the information he was going to give to him. Javat may have known, due to his self-realization, he may have understood in some way that the king was an elevated soul. He may have had that understanding that the king's anger was just like a thin covering. It's interesting here. So, like disturbance and anger, actually, Prabhupada Prabhu, when he was my Sankirtan leader many years ago on Every Town Village program, he would at the end of the day would always ask me whether I'd met anyone who had any objections to what we were doing, or did I meet anyone who had any questions or had any reservations about what we were doing, because he would always be waiting with relevant answers to people's questions. Prabhupada Prabhu felt that this was the real kind of icing on the cake of doing Sankirtan book distribution, and just waiting for a person who had some strong objection to what we were presenting, and then to be able to counter that objection with transcendental knowledge. Because when somebody has a strong objection, especially if they're intelligent people or people in positions of responsibility, then they're exercising their intelligence, they're exercising their power of discrimination. And in that mood, then they can understand a solution coming from a higher perspective. So it's good for us to always be prepared. Even if we're not as renounced as Javat, we've got all of the knowledge. In one sense, we've got access to so much knowledge. So there is a danger that we can become overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge that we've got, and that we're not able to recall it in a relevant way when we meet someone who's actually ripe for hearing. So it's good for that reason, Srila Prabhupada wanted us to read the books from all different angles of vision. He wanted us to discuss amongst ourselves how to present the knowledge in different circumstances to different people. And he would often, if someone asked, he would want his disciples to be given class even when he was there. He wanted us to practice the techniques of preaching, the techniques of divulging this knowledge in different circumstances. And we were reading in Chaitanya Charitamrita a couple of weeks ago that Srila Prabhupada had noted that even though the general populace of the so-called Western countries were engaged in very degraded activities, very violent activities, involved in violence to themselves through intoxication and violence to other living entities and meat eating, even though they were by normal Vedic standards completely unqualified, but because they had a tradition of being passionate about understanding the truth and trying to create equality in society, and trying to understand the essence of things, then their minds were trained in this process of analysis, and therefore they were able to really understand the depth of the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, whereas persons in India who've been following a kind of semblance of Bhakti Yoga for centuries, but they'd lost that inquiring mind. They weren't so much inquisitive because they felt that they already knew everything. So, we're not going to likely to meet many kings, but if whoever we meet who's got some deep interest in a particular field of politics or of environmental issues or of gender equality, race equality, all of these things, they require a lot of intellectual kind of meditation, and that is a kind of fertile ground for processing the knowledge or the philosophy of Krishna consciousness. But even though the ground may be fertile, we have to know how to plant the seed. We have to know the appropriate means to do so. So therefore it's good to discuss amongst ourselves, to learn how to do that. And I would definitely, personally, I feel that I really need to have that discussion amongst devotees, because if we don't get that discussion amongst devotees, then there's a tendency to look for it outside of the association of devotees, and then there's a danger that we become and that our devotional creeper becomes like polluted or compromised. Does have any more comments or questions?
Well, we've been doing the course on care actually, and the point came up there that we have to become more adept, more capable, more professional really in the way that we're applying the principles of Krishna consciousness. So it's interesting here that Javat was just, they were just pushing past him as a dullard. He wasn't even considered, he wasn't even on the bottom rung of society, he was just a total reject. And then he suddenly spins around and speaks this beautiful Sanskrit. And the king, the topmost educated person in society at that time, is immediately able to understand that he's very elevated, and they're very accomplished. So for ourselves as well, maybe the reason we took up devotional service was because we were materially very unqualified. The challenge now is, can we become so have such a profound grasp of the philosophy that when we present it, professional people are bowled over.
Well, devotees like Mahatma Prabhu are leading the way in that field. And personally, I feel that even if we don't attain that level of proficiency that he has, we can assist him in so many ways by bringing devotees like that in contact with a greater variety of audiences. And I know when Srila Prabhupada was always pleased when devotees brought scholars to speak with him, and if you remember Ranshaw Prabhu in one of his biographies saying that he felt that he had to, every day when he was out on Sankirtan, he was hoping that he was going to meet somebody who he could bring to Srila Prabhupada. There's so much dialogue going on now in the world between people who, before COVID and before things like Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter, before Trump supporters attacked the White House. Just a couple of years ago, people weren't talking to each other, but now, all of the world's academics, even though they're working in apparently what were previously unrelated fields, now they're all having Zoom calls together and trying to they really are actually trying to understand deep